As we kick off chapter 7, I have put a document into Canvas for you to think about, and it's ethical considerations. Now, you might think I signed up for accounting, not ethics. I agree with you. But as we start the chapter 7 content on fraud and our asset, the cash account, I want you to just kind of get in your mind the idea of ethics and how ethics and morals and values have such a huge impact on the topic of fraud. So before you move on to the content, just review these 10 and see what you think. And just remember that everybody has a little bit different viewpoint on ethics. Then we're going to get into the chapter details. So for chapter 7, please keep in mind that you guys have access to these documents I've created. Now, they're not all encompassing, but what they do provide is an overview of the chapter and the key content. So in chapter 7, what are we going to see? Well, first, we're going to see the fraud triangle. And a definition of fraud is that it's any act committed by an employee that's dishonest and it results in any personal benefit and costs the company. Okay. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about fraud is it may actually have an impact on people outside of the company as well. And that may not necessarily be a positive impact. So the fraud triangle tells us that these 3 opportunity, financial pressure or motivation, and rationalization components must be present for fraud to occur. So opportunity just means fraud could happen. So let's talk about robbing a bank. Everybody's heard of a bank robber. So if we don't have certain controls in place to rob a bank, then maybe everybody would do it, because I bet we could all think of something financially that we could benefit by having some extra money. So that's financial pressure motivation. And we might think that we can rationalize it by saying, you know what, the banks make enough money, they could share it with others. That's a very high level example of opportunity, financial pressure, and rationalization. And so some of the internal controls that prevent people from robbing banks are locks and safes and, well, just the sheer aspect of potentially going to jail. So that's an idea around this triangle and what makes fraud occur. Now, when we think about internal control, I want you to keep in mind that that is the only thing that can impact the fraud triangle in terms of opportunity. So internal controls are put into place to mitigate the opportunity for frauds to be committed. Now, when you think about that, I also want you to keep in mind the question, do you or do you not lock the doors to your house or your car? That's a physical control. And why do you do that? You do that because you don't want your stuff to get stolen. Maybe it's your whole car. Maybe it's some valuables that you have in your car before you get ready to go home for the weekend. So that's a type of internal control. So I don't want you to overcomplicate this too much, because at the end of the day, controls are only there to provide a reasonable assurance, not absolute, that companies can meet their operations objectives, their reporting requirements, and they minimize fraud to the best extent possible. There is no way we can mitigate 100% of all frauds, even with internal control. And that's really important to remember. Now, when we're thinking about internal controls, there's a why component and a how component of internal control. The why is just why we do it. And if you read here, this is what we're trying to do. We want to keep the company's assets safe, and we want to make sure that we report things correctly. And that's important in terms of this course and what we're learning. Now, how we do it, okay, we can do it a few different ways. We can have some responsibility, have certain people who are responsible for certain areas. We can have things in documented procedures. A lot of companies will document their procedures to make sure that employees are trained appropriately and know what to do. Physical controls, we could lock things up. We could require password access. We can do independent checks where we just make sure that things are working appropriately or as we have determined that they should. And then one that's really key is the segregation of duties. Now, with segregation of duties, that says that not one person can have both custody and recording functions in their role. So, for example, a cashier can make a bank deposit, but they should not also be able to record record sales What that might do is if they can record the amount of cash being deposited and deposit the cash, maybe what's to prevent them from saying, well, it wasn't $1,000 deposit, it was only a $900 deposit. We only had 900 in sales and not 1,000. So that's the idea between segregation or separation of duties. Now, when we get into the next video, we're going to walk through an example of one of our famous cash controls, and every company does it, and that is our bank reconciliation. And so as we work through the bank reconciliation in this cash control, I want you to remember that it is a key control around monitoring our cash. And the goals of our bank reconciliation are to make sure that our cash balance is recorded appropriately and we are recording it in the right amount. So essentially, if we say we have $1 million, we're confirming we have the $1 million. And I want you to keep in mind that as an internal control, a bank reconciliation can only detect potential frauds. It can never prevent fraud. This is a great little image from the textbook that I think will be very helpful for you. And so as we think about this 2-column reconciliation we're getting ready to do, the goal that we're trying to achieve is that we start out with a balance that is different between our ledger, which is known as the books, and the bank. And that's okay. We just have to make sure that everything that gets us to being in balance, we know what's causing the difference. And so with that, I'm going to stop the video and we'll pick up with an example of the cash control bank reconciliations.